So for those of you just joining us, I'm Rita McGrath, and my guest this week is my friend, colleague, raconteur, occasional debate partner, Roger Martin. He is very famous as a consultant, as an author, ran the Monitor Group for a long time, did the Rotman Institute for Prosperity, and has been a real voice for creating great strategies in a more just and egalitarian world. So I think I hope that captures some of what you've been working on.
That's a nice intro. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we get to the book, which I definitely want to talk about, I'd love to get your reflections on sort of where strategy is today, because I think it's had a long and winding road, from the early days, when we really talked about things like the Boston Consulting Matrix and order of entry and that kind of thing. And I just love, you've watched it all these years, and I'd love to get your reflections on sort of that journey and where you think we are now with it.
Well, I hate to I hate to start a little bit on a dour note, but I'm kind of worried about the modern practice of strategy. Mm-hmm. I think it's gone in a couple of directions that I'm not nuts about since, if you will, the early days. I mean, the way I think about strategy is it really started as a discipline or a practice in 1963 with the foundation of BCG by the great, legendary, late Bruce Henderson, who really made it a discipline, essentially brought it over from the world of the military, because we've always had military strategy from Sun Tzu, on down, but brought it to business. And BCG was a great creation. It started the field. McKinsey, which had been around since 1920, but didn't do strategy because there was no such thing as strategy, watched BCG and said, oh my God, they will sort of decapitate us. They'll talk to the CEOs and we'll talk to the next level, and got it into strategy. Bain and Company spun off in BCG in 1973. And so you had three firms. Monitor came along in 1983. But in that period of 60s, 70s, and 80s, the so-called strategy consulting firms were strategy consulting firms. They did mainly strategy, not McKinsey, because they did gigantic other practice as well, but they had a very big strategy practice. Since then, other things have gotten way bigger and more important than strategy. So you might sell a $1 million, $2 million, $5 million strategy study, but if you slam together two Dow Jones 30 companies, your post-integration merger project will be 200 million, or your Salesforce reorganization will be 100 million, or your sort of kind of digital implementation will be 500 million. And so strategy, in my view, has become a tiny practice of what used to be the strategy firms. Mm-hmm. So it just isn't a focus anymore. Other things, and I'm not blaming them. They're kind of serving their clients, and their clients want these other things other than strategy. So there are fewer people, and I think there are fewer leading edge ideas coming out of the strategy, the so-called strategy firms than they're used to. And then in the strategy academy, and again, you're going to make me make enemies here, but I'm not nuts about the direction that it's gone. And I think, you and I are in some sense on the fringes of the strategy academy, where we're more practitioners, kind of writers, outside oriented people. But as you know, if you're inside the strategy world and you're trying to get tenure in strategy now, you have to show fealty to the resource-based view of the firm, or you have no chance. Right? We've consolidated on one view of strategy, and I hate to say it, but very, very few companies. I don't know if you've met companies that actually utilize the resource-based view of the firm kind of work. They use your stuff, they use Mike's stuff, they use lots of other people's, even my stuff, but I don't see them using that. So I think the strategy faculty has gone in a direction that isn't as friendly and helpful to companies. And the strategy consulting firms have spent their time on other things, so that there is, I think, a gap in the practice of strategy, the practical practice of strategy of the sort that you'd be interested in, of which, you know, Peter Drucker would have been interested in, I'm interested in. And so I don't feel awesome about the state of strategy in the world these days. And is that too dour? What do you think, Rita?
Uh, what do I think? I think we have a fragmentation of approaches. I do think one of the big problems with the academy, and actually I had a really long conversation with C.K. Prahalad about this many years ago. And he
Did
said,
you? Yeah.
yeah, and he said a couple of interesting things. He said, the first thing is when I'm writing for the strategy academic community, or even maybe the Harvard Business Review, they all want to know like what the body of evidence is from the past that I would be drawing my conclusions from. And he said, and you know, CK was brilliant at this, right? He said, I want to know what's happening in the future. I want to be thinking about the future. So when I think about the ideas that I'm really interested in right now, which is the shift in value from products and services to interactions and networks. When we think about the kinds of stuff you write about in the book, and I do want to get to the book, but the idea of looking at systemic issues, right? I mean, the strategy academics, resource-based view or not, you know, they break things down into pieces, and then they say we've got a, you know, a statistically significant correlation between this piece and that piece, because it's very hard to model the whole. I mean, there are some clever approaches to beginning to do that, but I think this sort of notion of really understanding the behavior of a system, and you may not know this, Roger, but my PhD was from Russ Ackoff's Social Systems Sciences
really?
at the PhD at the Wharton School.
Such a great man, such a great man.
Absolutely.
And I never met him. And sadly, Rita, somebody else who was a protege of his and knew me said, you and Russ would really get along. You should meet him. And so I said, sure, if he's game, you know, he's a god, I'll meet him. And we arranged a meeting about 3 months hence, and he passed away about a month before it. So I never had the chance to meet him. I corresponded a little bit in setting up the meeting, but anyway, which was a good life lesson. If something's important, why don't you just like do it now?
Do it now, right? Absolutely.
But this whole future thing, if I can just build on this, I mean, because I think we're completely simpatico on this, and I wrote an HBR article on this, right? Aristotle, who really invented the scientific approach that all of these tenure stream academics use, what I call conventional social sciences research methodologies. I mean, the father of that was Aristotle, who originally said 2,400 years ago, here's how you determine the cause of a given effect. Right, and that's Analytica Posteriora, maybe the most important book written in the history of science. But he warned, that very same gentleman warned. He said, by the way, this is for the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. Right. So this is a part of the world where if I let go of this pen, it falls. It fell last week. It fell 100 years ago. It fell 1,000 years ago, and it's going to fall 1,000 years from now. And he said this sort of analyzing data from the past is really valuable in that part of the world because it's representative of what will happen in the future. But the father of science said, by the way, there's another part of the world. And it's the part of the world where things can be other than they are. Right. So I used to illustrate this, right? Now, if it's more than kind of one arm's length away from you, right, you get the hives, right? Well, in 1998, that wasn't the case because there was no such thing as a smartphone. The first one was the BlackBerry in 1999. That's illustrative of the part of the world where things can be different than they are. And Aristotle said incredibly clearly, do not use my method in that part of the world. Right? Why? It's because data from the past is what? Not representative of data that may be created in the future. And he said, quite lyrically, I think, the job of human beings in that part of the world is be the cause of the new effect. And so that's in some sense what you try to do, I think, in your work, Rita, is try to cause things to happen, and encourage companies to cause things to happen that haven't happened before. And because they haven't happened before, there is no data to support the notion that it will happen, right? And what Aristotle said, in that part of the world, your job, being rigorous, is imagining possibilities and choosing the one for which the most compelling argument can be made, not for which there's the most data, because he was smart enough to say, there won't be any data.
Right.
There won't be any direct data, any statistically significant data, but it doesn't mean that there won't be an argument that you can make that says this is worth trying.
Right.
And we have A, too little of that, and B, we are teaching our MBA students that all decisions must be data-based. You're some kind of corporate floozy if you make decisions that aren't based on data. That's against what the father of data analytics 2,400 years ago was crystal clear on.
Absolutely. So I want to connect this to one of the pieces of work of yours that I just love, which is the whole story of P&G, the invention of mastic. And you walk, I mean, I remember some months ago, I watched a presentation where you walked people through before we get into the number crunching and the data and the expensive stuff, right? Let's use our imaginations first. And I'd love it if you wouldn't mind telling that story just briefly about how you guys conceived of it, thought of it, and then that sort of thought experiment part before you even get to the let's hire the consultants and do all this money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we did research, but much more qualitative kind of research, just to say what, kind of what's going on here, and why is Olay stuck at a flat 750 million and sort of $1 billion and up are the brands that make sense. Why? What is it about women that put us in that position, maybe 7th to 10th biggest brand, which is on P&G like, and what we discovered is that they had this love-hate relationship with the prestige channel. Right, the first floor of Nordstrom's or
those guys that come chasing after you with the perfume. Don't you want to try this? Don't you want to try this?
That and that, by the way, you are not unlike the which is that they love the fact that it's high quality and that it's always in stock, and like they hate the pushy sales techniques, and they hate the fact, as I'm sure you do as a very busy woman, that they have to make an extra trip. They're in the mass channels kind of on a weekly basis, just getting the stuff they normally get, so it's handier. So we discovered that, and we discovered that women below 40 of the age of 50 didn't feel that the products were targeted for them. And
well, that was the famous period of the oil of old lady.
Yes, oil of old lady, exactly. But also, that they didn't really see anybody else particularly serving them well or targeting them well, or even speaking to them. And so we imagined, well, what is it possible to create something that has a bunch of the good aspects of prestige, but is delivered in mass and targeted not at 50 plus segment with sort of one benefit, sort of minimizing kind of wrinkling of the skin, but a broader array of features. And that's where we imagined the mastige idea. And I say we, it was mainly great Procter & Gamble people, Jenna Drosis and Susan Arnold and A.G. Lafley. But it's then and only then when you've got when you've got an idea, a sort of that here's how we could appeal to those women. Here's what it would have to look like. Here's what we would have to do with the trade channel. That you then go and do the really heavy lifting and the more quantitative research. But as the great A.G. Lafley always said, he says the analysis can never be more than an aid to my judgment. Right, and he is, and you know him, I'm sure he is like a numbers junkie. Like he's an analytical wizard, but even the analytical wizard says the best it can ever be is an aid to my judgment. And in the end, right, he pulled the trigger on that without having proof that it would
Mhm.
work.
Right.
But he'd worked through a bunch of things. We had Target convinced to try this, to set up a prestige like feeling in that aisle. So you can sort of peel away things that you can kind of knock off the list. But it was a new thing that we couldn't be certain that the women who walked into that Target aisle would say, I will pay 4 times. It was $18.99 price point instead of $4.99 price point, what I was paying for before.
Yeah, fascinating. And what I love about it is the iterative nature of the process that you use. So I do want to get to the book. I want to make sure, because I
Sure.
could talk to you all day. I mean,
Likewise.
And so the book is When More Is Not Better. And as you can see, I've been spending some real
Oh my
quality
goodness.
time with it. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And
Oh, good.
I think the first thing that really hit me over the head about the book was your observation that in the US, anyway, we've had this interesting combination of democracy and capitalism. And if the mass of people do not feel that capitalism is working for them, that if we actually do have a democracy, they'll vote for something else.
Yeah.
And I think the core theme of the book is that things that should be treated as systems and where we need to really see the whole system in balance have been distorted by the need to optimize parts of these systems. And I think the pandemic, your timing could not be better. I mean, the pandemic has made this obvious to the ordinary person, right? So maybe just tell us the story of the book and what are some of the things you hope people will take away from it.
Sure. Well, that is, I mean, that's a good summary and an unsurprising one from a Russell Acuff, a student. In that is a core finding of the book. Really, that without necessarily saying so, we've treated the economy and even the political economy as a big, complicated machine, like an automobile, right? And so an automobile is a big, complicated machine. There's the powertrain, there's the braking system, there's a heating, ventilating, air conditioning, there's a safety system. All of these systems, and to deal with the complexity or the complicatedness of that, we break it into those disciplines and have somebody say, well, do a powertrain and it should have these attributes, do braking system, it should have these attributes, and we add it up. And if it's a complicated system, you can kind of figure it out well enough to add it up, and it's a car. The economy is a complex system where cause and effect aren't so clear. It's not like if you press on that pedal called the gas pedal, it'll go faster. If you press on that pedal, it might, but it might careen out of control. It might go sideways. It's a system where you just can't tease those things apart for a while and then put them together. You are operating on the whole, but maybe even most importantly, it's adaptive, right? A car is not adaptive. A machine is not adaptive. It doesn't say, "Wow, Rita kind of jams on the gas kind of really quickly when she starts going. I should adapt to that, and when she pushes hard, I'll just open the carburetor a little bit." They don't adapt in that way.
And Roger doesn't, and so I'll just behave. My carburetor will behave differently when Roger's driving.
Exactly. So, but in an adaptive system, whatever rules are in place, the creatures in it adapt to it. It's just like a tree, right? If you're growing behind a big tree, you're going to kind of grow sideways to adapt to the fact that you still need light. Or if the Clinton administration says we're going to stop CEO compensation from rising by making only the first $1 million of compensation deductible for corporate income tax purposes, they don't just say, oh, okay, well, we will put the brakes on CEO compensation. They say, hey, now here's an idea. Why don't we give them stock options instead? And they are not taxable in kind of any way to them or anybody else. And sure enough, your clever methodology for reducing CEO compensation, or at least flattening it, ends up with CEO compensation being 10 times its high 10 years later. That's adaptation. So what we have is a system that we're treating like a machine. It's more like a natural system And by treating it like a machine, we have taken sort of the rules of machines, which is keep pushing and pushing for ultimate efficiency. Let's make that car run as efficiently as possible. More efficiency is always better. And we've put pressure on. So in our system, we say, well, let's put more pressure on it. Let's open up markets to international trade. Let's deregulate. Let's encourage kind of mergers to get kind of big and supposedly more efficient in the capital markets. And all of that stuff has inadvertently taken that natural system and caused it to produce a set of outcomes that we never expected. Right. The general conception of the economy really is that the outcomes are going to be largely normally distributed, bell-shaped. A big middle class. We all know with a big middle class. Some rich people, fewer rich people, fewer poor people. And if we keep pursuing efficiency, productivity will rise, and that distribution will march to the right to higher and higher incomes. What we didn't realize that in complex adaptive systems, especially if you start pushing harder and harder, putting more and more pressure on them, and if the connection between things in that there's a ease of connection, it turns into a Pareto distribution, the 80-20 distribution that Wilfredo Pareto first observed, where he noted that 20% of Italian families owned 80% of the land at the end of the 19th century. That's what we're getting, Rita. We are getting something that is looking more Pareto every day, which means that most observations, and let's use family income as the option, are being pushed to the left, to the low end, and then a very few observations, the 1%, are getting more and more, so that when we have $1 of economic growth in the American economy, now that $1 of growth is most likely to head into the pockets of somebody in the 99.999th percentile. 40 years ago, it was actually most likely to end up in the pockets of somebody at the 5th percentile, which I think probably you and I could agree, you kind of want that, right? You know, that's just a pretty much inherently good thing. The people who need an incremental dollar most are most likely to get it. The people who need it least are least likely to get it. Now we've switched. The people who need it most are least likely to get it. The people who need it least are most likely to get it. And that's in a nutshell my worry stated in the book, that because this isn't totalitarian capitalism of the sort we now are getting increasingly in China, right? That's an increasingly capitalist country, and it's totalitarian. If we want democratic capitalism, 51% of people have to say, this is working for me. Mm-hmm. And it's just not right now. In fact, ever since 1976, the median family income can be expected to grow to double every 100 years. Prior to that, it was doubling every 30 years. So you could actually sit at the kitchen table as a median family and be able to look at your kids and say, you know, when they're my age, they'll have double the real income I'll have. And I think any reasonable family at the median could say, that's pretty good. That works. That works. Right. But if they were saying, you know, my children's children's children will be have twice the income we have, it's sort of like, you know, kind of blah, right? That sounds like a century from now. Well, that's because it is, right? And that's just a long time. So that's the concern in the book, that we inadvertently, I'm not blaming this on anybody. Nobody, I don't think, in America had the plan that said, we are going to accidentally do a bunch of things that is going to create a situation in which very, very, very few people are benefiting from economic growth. We need everybody to work on economic growth for the benefit of few. Nobody. I don't know if you've met anybody like that. I don't know anybody that's done that. I think it's inadvertently happened.
Yeah, I mean, I guess where I come down on that, and I've been following the work of Bill Lazonick on things
Oh
like
yeah, I love Bill. I love Bill. Yeah, he's terrific.
on things like stock buybacks.
Yep.
Look at the argument made by the people at Patriotic Millionaires, Just Capital. What they're basically saying
Yep.
is, and I think this does relate to your argument, which is millions of narrowly shaped, incentivized decisions. So, just as a specific example, I can take a position as an activist investor. I own a tiny share of a company's total stock. I have had no relationship with the company ever. I
Yep.
have not contributed to what it is. I've not built it up. I've not done anything. But because of the way our financial system is structured, I can have this completely disproportionate effect on senior leadership decisions, and often lead to outcomes that are in the long run quite devastating. So the specific one I lived with, because I was working with them at the time, was the activist that came into DuPont.
Oh, really? You were, yeah.
Who was involved with DuPont at the time. And, Ellen Kullman, who I think is one of the best leaders I've ever met,
Yeah.
actually won. She won the activist argument.
Yeah.
Her board sided with her. The shareholders were on her side, the vast majority of them, not the activists, obviously. And yet it had so ripped apart that management structure, their focus, their ability to do things. She ended up basically retiring
Yeah.
without ever being able to really fulfill her vision for the company because of this sort of bizarre interruption from the financial markets. And to me, that's just one example where at a micro level, if you're allowed to as an activist, this thing might pay off for you in the short term and and yet we kind of allow that. And so one of the things I struggle with is what kind of regulatory regime can help. And I think one of the great arguments you make in the book is the notion of friction.
Yes.
Because
Yes. Well, and in a form of friction, and on that one, I have one that's directly one of the, I have 18 recommendations in the book, and one is on kind of time-based voting rights. So I would say that you should give any shareholder one extra vote per day they own the stock up to 4,000 days, so a little over 10 years. And so literally, if you were a long-term holder of DuPont and you bought a share, you'd vote 4,000 shares when that activist investor came along. And that would make it very hard. And so if the activist investor approached you to buy your share, they would buy it, and then they have it for one day, and they would be worth one share. And so anybody who's invested longer term has a dramatically higher stake, and like 4,000 times as high a stake essentially as that activist. And again, any recommendation that makes it in the book has to have already been done somewhere. And the French have done this. If you're a long-term shareholder, you get 2 shares, 2 votes for everyone. The Phalange Act, and I just say that's not nearly a lot enough, because I think the activist investors are the hyenas of the modern economy. They hunt in packs and they destroy good things. But the system kind of works, totally to make it easy for them to do their thing. I just make it hard. And again, people say, "Oh, well, that will entrench management." Kind of no, it won't. Why is it? Why would it? Why would Rita McGrath be particularly kind of silly about management and trusting management just because she's been a shareholder for 10 years? If they don't do a good job, you'll sell that share anyway. The arguments against it are vacuous. When I push back on them, they're like, well, it's radical. Yeah, well, so has been the arrival of hedge funds. The other thing I would forbid is lending of stocks by pension funds. So essentially, the lending of stocks is necessary for you to short a stock, and we have between a $4 trillion and $8 trillion short on the world's capital markets at any given time, equity markets at any given time. 90% of the shares that are lent come from pension funds. Pension funds are interested in one thing only, or should be interested in one thing only, having their value of their portfolios as high as possible over a longest period of time possible to pay off the pensioners. And they're facilitating a giant short. And it's even worse than a giant short because those short positions come on and off and just jerk around stock prices. And 80% of the large pension funds in the US are government monopoly pension funds, right? So if you're a Texas teacher, you don't have a choice of where you put your money, your pension, or who holds your pension money. Texas Teachers does. So what we have is a system where governments force people to put their pension in the hands of a monopoly provider, a monopsonist provider, who then goes and lends shares to nasty hedge fund people to short stocks and jerk them around. Why? Why do we allow that? It makes kind of no sense whatsoever. So I think there are things we can do in the capital markets to at least ameliorate the problems. And that this, Rita, is an important point in the book, which is this system worked quite well for 200 years, right? And so it's not that the system itself is really problematic. It's just we pushed it too far. That's why when more is not better, right? More ice cream is better for quite some time until you're eating so much ice cream that you get fat and sick. But eating ice cream is not a bad thing, right? So
well, it's not a bad thing unless that's your COVID coping mechanism.
Yes, that is true. That is true. So there's a bunch of these things we just have to dial it back. And I think we will have succeeded in a major way. We don't have to make activist hedge funds go away. We don't have to make hedge funds go away. We have to just take away their ability to cause kind of single-minded death and destruction, which is.
Yeah, and I mean, I thought your comment about frictions really throughout the book was very, very interesting. One of the things that I'm particularly passionate about, and I know you are as well, is Zeynep Tan's work on good jobs and her empirical demonstration. And this is also, there are many scholars who've looked at this, like Jeff Pfeffer, for example.
Yes.
You can provide good jobs, decent benefits, a decent life for people, and not incur these downsides. And her point is, we just look at employees as unit of cost, and that they're not, that, and Gary Hamel makes this point as well, which is human beings are incredibly ingenious creatures. Yeah. And if you let them, they can improve your revenue, they can improve your customer service, they can make you a forever company. But if you treat them like, poorly performing robots and reward them accordingly, you're not going to get any of those benefits.
Yes. Because that, you're absolutely right. And that is part, as you know, of the point in the book about proxies. When you say my proxy for being efficient with my employees is having the lowest possible wage, right, that I can get away with, right? It's just a terrible proxy, because it drives you to making them, as you say, a poorly performing robot, right? If you try to make a human into a robot, they'll do a crappy job. Mm-hmm. If you take a human and give them the opportunity to create and make things happen, it's marvelous. And you and I are singing from the same songbook on Zeynep. I've told her many times that for her generation, she's a much younger than me, at least. For her generation, she will end up being one of the 10 most influential business academics on the planet. I think she's now, she doesn't care much about that. She cares about making the jobs of workers. I mean, as you know, I'm chair of the Good Jobs Institute. She's the president, and the goal is to convert 10 million U.S. jobs from bad jobs to good jobs. That's the goal of the Good Jobs Institute.
There are some really early good signs. So there was just a study that came out this week looking at people who did not have college degrees, but could improve their incomes by, I think the phrase was 70%, by moving into jobs that had previously been ring fenced only for people that hold degrees. And another big hobby horse of mine. Like I think the requirement of a BA for so many jobs simply serves the recruiting entity's needs.
Yes.
It doesn't really, it doesn't serve the needs of the people, and it doesn't serve the needs of the company. Yeah. And on the one hand, I hear all these senior people screaming about, I can't find talented people. And on the other hand, there are all these incredibly talented people, and all that's in between them is this degree.
Yes.
It's crazy.
Yes, and silly proxy screens, right? The proxy for you being smart is you have a BA. No, not so. And there's where Costco is just such a brilliant company, right? Virtually all their senior management started on the shop floor, and many of them don't have advanced education, although they do a great job of sending back their terrific previously undereducated managers to get more education. But yeah, human ingenuity. I mean, Gary is typically way more right than wrong, right? Human ingenuity is an incredibly powerful force, and it is not, unfortunately, it's not that hard to crush, right? Like I think all you have to do is start sending signals. You don't want any of that ingenuity around here. We want you to do your job. It's like the old Henry Ford quote, right? You know, I want a pair of hands, and the damn things come with a mind attached, right? Henry Ford was famous for like verbalizing what he had in mind, but I think a hell of a lot of other executives would say the same thing. And this is also where, if you want bugaboos of mine, this is the fields, and I have some arguments with my dear friend Adam Grant on this, who hosts every year a conference on people analytics. Like if I were dictator, I would ban people analytics, right? Because if you just go back to Aristotle and say, what is people analytics? What's the fundamental presumption of people analytics? That you can tell everything about the future of a person from analyzing their past, right? So if this is what Rita does on the job and has for the past 5 years, that will always be Rita, and not asking the question, well, in what way could Rita be different, better? Maybe we could say, Rita, why don't you figure out how to serve customers better? Or Rita, is the assortment that we have, if this is retail, if the assortment we have based on your interaction with customers, is it the assortment you'd pick, or would you pick something else? But if you're into people analytics, that is unthinkable. You would never, there would be no justification for ever asking Rita that those questions, because data analytics would say she's never answered such a question in the past, so we can assume safely that she would be incapable of answering it in the future, which of course is just ludicrous on its face, but that's what it would say. So
a couple of questions in from the chat. One is, how do you teach people to think about complex adaptive systems in a richer way? And another is that how do we help innovation, the innovation community tackle some of these challenges?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the good news on complex adaptive systems, and here again, I say I will only make recommendations that somebody's done already. And
I should mention that about the book, by the way, but one of the things I really liked was, first of all, you devote a big portion of the book to solutions, which is unusual. Usually we have, 273 pages of chest reading about how awful things are, and then 10 pages. It's like all those academic papers, which says, suggestions for future research. Somebody should solve this. Right? At the end.
I pointed out the problem, somebody can solve it. Yeah. So MIT, like, the father, Jay Forster, father of system dynamics, now the great John Sterman, they teach people system dynamics. It is just utterly teachable, and it is mainly untaught, right? And so I actually think, among various things in the book, that would be one of the easier things to do, but it's just not on curricula. I try to do a whole lot of things at the Rotman School to change and improve the curriculum. And we did have, for a couple of years, we actually utilized John, the John Sterman, the Jay Forster chair holder at MIT Sloan, to help us design it. But there isn't, in business education, there is not a field of complex adaptive systems, and so it
Well,
just sort of.
arguably, I belonged to one that was trying, right, and it imploded over the course of years.
Really? Did you? Yeah.
They closed down the department. It got folded back into, I think, operations or management, and it no longer exists. But there's a whole cohort of us graduates out there that can keep in touch now and again.
Interesting. Okay. So you had an interesting, actually, come and talk to you. You had the same experience I did. So I worked hard to get something into the program, but it just people have to be in the bowels of a business school like you or I to understand it. I mean, everything is driven around what their fellow professors want to write about in the academic journals. And if you're doing something that isn't consistent with that, not. And design is one of the big things. Students have an insatiable desire for design thinking at business schools. Insatiable.
Design is about hope.
Yeah.
You can't design the foot of a chair and have it be in complete ignorance with the rest of the chair. I mean, you can't.
Exactly. But even though they want it, and companies want to recruit people who are MBAs who have a design sense, it is hard as hell to get design going in business school. Again, I did it while I was at the Rotman School, and when I left as dean, most of it got shut down. Now the students are screaming sufficiently loud that they're attempting to ramp it back up. But there is just a fundamental mismatch between what is going on in business schools today and what is needed for the future.
Well, and one of the more interesting elements to me and we're seeing it now, we're absolutely seeing it now, is the schools that are really innovating. And I'm thinking here of Arizona State, Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors. They're able to, in some ways, to escape those constraints because they're a little bit non-conventional players. And when I think of the individuals that are really thinking about these future-oriented things, it tends to be people who are, I mean, I'll use myself as an example, yourself as an example, not in that mold perfectly, right? We're a little in between discipline. I mean, even Michael Porter was in between disciplines in a way.
Yes.
And so I think it's having that sort of in between space that lets you see right, left, and center what others don't. And I mean, if I go back to the big consulting firms, and again, no disrespect to them, but their financial model is all around what is, and so my incentive to propose something that's going to radically change that model is probably not at the top of my list.
Yes. No, and as they've gotten to be gigantic firms, right? So it's hard to tell. McKinsey's private, but I think last estimate I saw was like an $8 billion firm. They need to be fed by product revenue. Mm-hmm. So post-merger integration is a product. It's very kind of defined. You must create 19 task forces. They each need a mandate. This should be the composition of them. This should be the work plan for them. That's very productized, right? As opposed to sort of, hey, can you come in and help create the future for us? That may. And I'm sure they do studies of that sort, but that does not feed the pyramid, the gigantic $8 billion pyramid. That's a side thing. So sort of the how to help somebody conceptualize and invent a future that does not now exist.
Right.
is not something that they're gonna spend a whole lot of time and energy on developing.
Right. When I have a lot of friends who are in the sort of think tank parts of those big firms.
Oh, yes.
It's a lonely life.
Oh, really?
Really lonely life. But David Maister years ago talked about the shape of professional service firms, and it's always informed how I think about them, which he says, you've got the firms that are basically procedures, right? Come in and put in payroll, come in and put in SAP, or come in and do a MERD, well understood problem, well defined. And your pyramids there can be like this. So you're making boatloads of money. Yes. Then you have the gray hair things, which is trust me, I've been through this before, you won't go wrong, and you take the binder off the shelf and maybe 20% of it's customized and the rest just, yeah, you've been through it before. And then the hardest thing I think to do and to pay for is the brain's work, right? It's the, Roger, here's a really interesting problem. And let me have you think about that problem. So things like tax rates, right? I mean, in the book, you talk about things like tax rates. How do we get people open to even discussing those things? And what I'm intrigued by with tax rates is that's a clear case to me of zero sum thinking, right? So if my tax rate goes from 90% to 30%, I'm going to be better off. Well, only if you assume the pot of income you're addressing is static, right? Whereas if the pot of income you're addressing is growing, guess what? You might be better off with a 90% tax rate. And people don't think that way.
No, you're right. It's and again, I think people actually think that way in their regular life. Like one of the things I'm working on, and I want to write about. So I'll market test it with you,
okay.
Rita. Is inhuman versus human system, not inhumane, inhuman. So I think whenever we talk ourselves into a business kind of system or principle that is inconsistent with how, as human beings, when we interact, works, we create a problem. So Milton Friedman came up with the business of business is business, 1970 New York Times Magazine article that was built on by Mike Jensen, who talked about the absolute importance of a singular corporate objective function. But the key argument was, unless you have a singular objective function, you won't know how to make decisions, and confusion will reign. Okay, so I'm increasingly thinking that you should always test those against, is that how human beings actually work? Because if it's inhuman, right, then you're trying to jam human beings into a system that is inconsistent with their humanity, and bad things will happen. It would be my argument. So I'd ask Rita, is that how you run your life? You have a single objective function. You want to pursue your career, and husband, children, they're secondary because I have a single objective function, right? And the answer is come on, Roger, obviously not. Rita, probably, I suspect, though you can tell me otherwise, probably have had to struggle all your life through making decisions of balancing my career, my family, and everything. And you just live with that and say, oh, sometimes I go too much this way, and sometimes I go too much this way.
Always.
Yeah,
always.
Right.
And then add on top of that the guilt, right? So,
right, yes.
So if I'm the world's best cookie baking mother on Tuesday, and I'm the world's hardest charging career woman on Wednesday, I've got this complete cognitive dissonance.
Yes. So Rita, as a human being, is used to having multiple conflicting goals, which she trades off and thinks about every day and tries to find clever ways of doing both. And so then if we say, oh no, but in a corporation, you can't do that. You have to have a single objective function. What I'm increasingly seeing is whenever we do that, bad things happen, because humans can't and won't stop being human entirely. And so it'll strike them as odd, off-putting. It's like, again, if do you take friends that you've had for 10 years that have been good friends for 10 years and just say, I have too many friends, so I'm doing a riff on friends and getting rid of 15% of my friends, and I just phone them up and say, you're in the 15% that I'm just letting go. No, human beings don't do that. We do that in corporations. So I want to write something on whenever we have a theory in business that we use to guide our decisions, we should test it against, is that how human beings work? And the farther it is from how human beings work, the more collateral damage it will acquire, the more unintended consequences it will produce, and it'll eventually, kind of go to hell in a handbasket, which, 50 years after the Milton Friedman article, I would argue that theory is largely in tatters. It's got another probably 10 years to run, because these things take a long time to flush out of the system, but it's largely in tatters. And what I'm saying is, I don't think this is a 2020 hindsight thing. I think at the time, if we would have had that judgment, if we'd have made that judgment, is this human or inhuman? Oh, it's inhuman. Why don't we try and accomplish the same goal with a human system that's consistent with how people interact? Should I write this?
I like
Should I
that.
write about this?
I think you should. So I'll give you a little more local flavor on the Milton Friedman thing. So what prompted the Milton Friedman thing, and this is something Bill Lazonic writes about, was a movement by community members, including some very famous people, to put 2 community members on GM's board. And the position they wanted GM to pursue was greater safety, less environmental impact, more kind of fuel efficient, less sort of highly stylized, more kind of fuel efficient cars. So 1970, right? Friedman comes back and says, absolutely not. The purpose of business is business, shareholders only. This motion to get people on the shareholder was resoundingly defeated. Okay, fast forward a couple of years. What did the Japanese win on in the United States? More fuel efficient.
All that stuff.
Cars that were better designed, that uses every single thing those community people wanted. Competitors actually came in and did. And to me, that's the fascinating lesson for business, which is, what if you listen to those people? You know, what if you had more diversity on your boards and you could really say, well, maybe they've got a point, right? Because it ended up being, I mean, they had to be bailed out. It was a horrific reversal. It was the whole, you know, as when I was growing up, and I'll betray my cohort here, but when I was growing up, the mantra was, you know, buy American cars because you can always get spare parts when they break down.
Yes.
And the Japanese were like, well, why would they break down?
That problem. But that is so fascinating, because, you know, what really screwed GM and Ford was we had the energy crisis, the influx of small vehicles, so that the first small vehicles, in GM's case, were the X cars in 1980, and they were crappy. If they would have listened in 1968, 1969, they would have had 10 years. 10 years advance on that, and the entire industry might be different, because it was into that vacuum where they couldn't figure that out for 20 years. That's when the Japanese shares went kind of through the roof. And once you're there, you know, once the Japanese had that, you know, possession is 9/10 of the law. Once they had possession of whatever by 1990, when they're 20 share points or something, it's super hard to get those 20 share points back. And of course, they never had.
Yeah. And I mean, I think your point about human versus inhuman is so much of our design of systems. And there was a question in the chat about Citizens United, which I'll be interested in asking. But so much of our design of systems is on this bedrock of economic man, you know?
Yes.
And what we've painfully learned over so many years, these are inhuman systems. The economic man does not behave the way humans. I mean, we've known this since the time of Jim March. I mean, we satisfy, we shortcut, we take problems as what was the garbage can model. You know, I mean, there's all this stuff that comes to us that has already been studied. And Jeff Pfeffer makes this point very well. He says, it's not that we don't know this. It's that for whatever reason, we don't want to act on it. And one of the things I think that's problematic, and I think Citizens United is part of that whole gestalt, is somebody somewhere said, I've got it. You know, if we allow activist investors, you know, in a short run, I can make this, that, this, that, this, that. Just personally for me on an individual basis, we don't look at, well, what does that mean for the whole system in which we're operating? And so we have this, to me, kind of calamity where the individually, and people have written about capital market myopia, and they've written about the tragedy of the commons, where individually compelling decisions lead up to
a big bust,
catastrophe for the whole.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and you know, and this is one of the things I then talk about in the book, which is we set ourselves up for that. So because the way we legislate is now, especially in Washington, it's like you fight, battle, listen to all the lobbyists, fight to get it to the floor, to finally get it voted on, and you want to make it perfect. So you try to get perfection, and then you want to make it permanent. Mm-hmm. And this is just perfect for all the gamers.
Yeah.
And say it took 8 years to get that through Congress, and now it's going to be this way for 50 years, and so I can now game the hell out of it. here's where I like, even though there's a bunch of things that I don't like about the NFL, I like about the NFL, right? The National Football League. They have a competition committee that meets after every season and tweaks the system, make sure that essentially, they don't say this specifically, but essentially that offense and defense are in balance, because that's what makes a good game. If offense or defense dominates completely, it ceases to be a good game, any game. And so they're just sort of bloody minded about it, and they're not moral about it. When Bill Walsh, the legendary Bill Walsh, invented the West Coast offense, they said after a couple of Super Bowls, okay, Bill, that was clever, but we're going to shut you down. And they just like tweaked the rules to make his offense work less effectively. And they didn't sue him. They didn't throw him in jail. They just said, we're going to tweak the rules because we have a greater interest, which is the game. You want to win. You've won a couple of Super Bowls improbably with what was a crummy team. That's enough. We're now changing. I think we should do that with every piece of legislation. We should recognize that we're going to have to tweak it and tweak it and tweak it, because then the gamers won't jump all over it, because it's not worth investing in gaming a system that they're just going to tweak on you kind of right after it. So again, there are ways to handle a whole bunch of the phenomenon that we see. We just have to have that decision to say we can and will kind of take care of this system in a more kind of thorough and responsible way.
Like gardening, you use the example of gardening.
Yeah. No, it is.
So I'm conscious that we're really at time. So a couple of, and in the book you talk about, like, don't think you have to boil the ocean, right? You can start with doing a few things as citizens, as parents, as educators. Where would you leave our audience with some suggestions along those lines?
Yeah, well, everybody in the audience is a citizen, and one of the things that every citizen can do is multi-home, right? So with the rise of the giants, the new monopolists that are bigger and more powerful than any monopolists we've had before, we're feeding them when we say, we love Amazon and I'm going to order everything off of Amazon Prime. I'm not like against Amazon, but I'd say, make sure you spread your purchases around, or you will be contributing to Amazon's domination. And the sad thing about monopolies, and you can see it in Amazon already, Amazon on the way up never put their own searches for their own products ahead of the number one search. They never screwed around with the search algorithm. They are now. Why? Because we've given that capacity to them. Instead, buy 50% of your stuff from Amazon, and some from your local store, some from a chain store, some from some other online dealer. Just multi-home everywhere. Facebook, sure. If you want your news feed from Facebook, subscribe to a local newspaper. We've just got to not have our own purchases drive the monopolization of our world and this extreme tail of the distribution. So that would be one thing I'd leave people.
That's fantastic. So we can do that. Anybody here could do that.
Anybody here can do that.
And are you hopeful now that we seem to be moving to a new perspective anyway on what the balance between interests in society should be, at least here in the U.S.?
To be honest, no. Now, this may be an unpopular answer, but if you look back over the last 50 years, right? It's been control of the Congress, 30 years, Democrats, 20 years, Republicans, control of the presidency, 30 years, Republicans, 20 years, Democrats. This is not the book is apolitical because both parties have bought into the machine metaphor. They do it a little bit differently, but they've both bought into it. So I can't. So no, I'm not suddenly encouraged on that front. There are other things about that I would say I'm encouraged about. But in terms of this core thing, I'm not sure, right? Kind of the Washington consensus, efficiency, all of that stuff was as much Democrat as Republican. So I'm taking much more of a wait and see on this to see if there are signs that it is. I actually think that I'd count on citizens and businesses to go early, and I hope then the politicians kind of listen and start to rethink some of their theories.
So let's finish with the example of the stone crab place,
Yes.
which I just
So yeah, if anybody's ever in Miami, try and get a reservation at Joe's Stone Crabs. It's this wonderful restaurant. It's the single top grossing independent restaurant, like single restaurant as opposed to chain in all of America. It's been around for over 100 years, and it is run sort of against all the norms of efficiency. They pay their staff more than they need to pay them. They pay their suppliers more than they need to pay them. They've been owned by a family for now 4 generations. Their employees tend to stay 10 plus years in an industry that has 70% turnover. They care about having menu items on the menu that allow people of modest incomes to eat, along with the people who are ordering very expensive stone crab claws, and it's a manifestation of a family that thinks of it as being part of a complex adaptive system, and did things long before. In the terrible old days, a Black person was not allowed on Miami Beach at night. It's just horrible. And so the founder of Joe's Stone Crabs literally drove all of his African-American employees home at night because he said it's not fair that we can't have any Black employees because they could not come and work here because they get arrested after they on the way home. So you can always carve out your own way. You can be human. You can be reflective of the way the world really works. And in this case, is that a trade-off? What other 100-plus-year-old restaurants that are number one in the country in revenues do you know? Did this make it tough for them to do business? No, it made them magnificent. And so everybody can do it. Everybody can do it. We just hold ourselves back with these flawed, inhuman models.
That's a wonderful thought to finish with. Roger, I'm so pleased. I could spend all day with you, but thank you so much for spending an hour. Congratulations on the book. I hear it's doing really, really well. Just for those of you that haven't seen it yet, When More Is Not Better, Overcoming America's Obsession with Economic Efficiency. Thank you all. See you next week.
Thank you so much for having me, Rita. It was a pleasure.